The story does not begin with angels, halos, or a forbidden apple. It begins with exhaustion, with labor pushed beyond its limit, with beings who were never meant to work deciding they would no longer do so. Long before temples rose or laws were written, the world was already running on systems, hierarchies, and tasks that demanded maintenance. Rivers had to be controlled, land had to be shaped, and order had to be enforced against chaos. What followed was not a miracle but a solution, deliberate, calculated, and deeply unsettling. Ancient memories, pressed into clay and buried under millennia of dust, describe a place that was enclosed, supervised, and functional. Not a paradise, but a controlled environment. Not a garden of rest, but a site of production. When these fragments are read side by side, a different Edin emerges, one that looks less like a myth of innocence and more like the echo of an experiment whose consequences we are still living with. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself and let's dive in. The land between the Tigris and the Euphrates was never silent. Even before cities existed, before walls and kings, the rivers dictated rhythm through flood and retreat, turning dust into mud, mud into fertile ground, and fertile ground into obligation. Each year the waters surged, unpredictable and violent, and each year someone or something had to tame them. Channels were cut, embankments raised, marshes drained. This was not divine poetry, it was hydraulic engineering on a colossal scale. The earliest memories preserved in Mesopotamian clay do not speak of rest, but of strain, of bodies bent under endless labor, of a system that demanded upkeep without pause. In those memories, the cosmos itself functioned like an estate divided by rank. At the top stood the great Anunnaki, whose name meant those who came from heaven to earth, not as ghosts or abstractions, but as ruling authorities. Beneath them existed another class, the Igigi, lesser gods tasked with the physical work that sustained order. They dug the riverbeds with their own hands, hauled baskets of soil, reinforced the banks that kept the waters from swallowing everything whole. The texts linger on the weight of this labor, describing shoulders raw from carrying earth and nights without rest, using language that mirrors how later humans would describe forced labor or enslavement. Fatigue was not metaphorical. It was counted, measured, endured. For what the Atrahasis epic records as 40 divine years, a span that suggests an age so long it blurs into eternity, the Igigi worked. Time for these beings was not marked by aging bodies but by repetition. The same motions, the same demands, the same silence from above. Eventually something shifted. The tablets describe a moment of reckoning when the Igigi began to count their years of service. Counting, in ancient thought, was an act of awareness. To count was to compare, and to compare was to judge. They realized the imbalance was permanent, there would be no end. What followed was not a fall from grace or a spiritual corruption, it was a revolt. Tools were burned, an act heavy with symbolism, because a burned tool cannot be picked up again. Torches were lit, and the Igigi marched at night to the dwelling of Enlil, the god who governed the air, the land, and by extension, the labor performed upon it. Darkness mattered. Night was when guards were weakest, when order thinned. The text records the timing with precision, the hour before dawn, when the world holds its breath. Enlil did not respond with thunder. He responded with fear. The tablets describe him barricading his doors, his authority suddenly fragile when confronted by sheer numbers. His messenger, Nusku, was sent out to speak, to identify a leader who could be punished and made an example of. The answer shattered that logic. There was no leader. The rebellion was collective. Every worker was complicit. Punishment would require destroying the entire system that made the cosmos function. An assembly was called. Anu descended from the heights of the sky, embodying distant sovereignty, while Enki rose from the Apsu, the subterranean freshwater deep believed to be the source of life itself. Assemblies in Mesopotamian texts resemble councils of administrators more than divine rituals. Problems are presented, options weighed, consequences considered. When violence is proposed, it is rejected not on moral grounds but on practicality. Killing the Igigi would solve nothing. The work would still need to be done. It was Enki who articulated the alternative. Known as the god of wisdom not because of abstract philosophy but because of technical ingenuity, Enki specialized in solutions. His domains included canals, crafts, and the kind of knowledge that makes systems run. His proposal was stark in its simplicity: create a substitute. If the Igigi could no longer bear the burden, a new being would be fashioned to carry it instead. This being would be designed for labor from the outset. The term used for this creation was Lulu, often translated as the mixed one or the primitive worker. It was not a title of honor. It was a functional label, the way one might name a tool by its purpose. This new being would not rule, would not debate, would not sit in assemblies. It would work. The decision was approved. What had begun as a labor dispute became a design project. The place chosen for this undertaking was not a metaphorical heaven. The word later rendered as Edin traces back to the Sumerian Edin, meaning plain or steppe, a real geographic zone in southern Mesopotamia. Texts describe it as enclosed, marked off, protected. Boundaries matter in engineering. An open field cannot be controlled, but a restricted area can be monitored, adjusted, corrected. The Edin was not wilderness, it was a managed space. Here, the contrast with later religious retellings becomes sharp. In the book of Genesis, the human is placed in the garden to till it and to keep it. The verbs imply service and guarding, maintenance, rather than leisure. The older texts make this explicit. From the moment of placement, the human was a worker, and the garden was not a reward but an assignment. Creation itself was not instantaneous. Unlike the poetic breath of life described centuries later, the Mesopotamian process unfolded step by step. Materials were specified, roles were assigned, there were debates, revisions, and failures. The very fact that failure is recorded tells us something crucial. Omnipotence does not fail. Experimentation does. Clay was selected, but not ordinary clay scooped from any riverbank. It was taken from the Apsu, imagined as a freshwater abyss beneath the earth, the source from which fertility emerged. Clay from the Apsu was considered primordial, closer to the raw substance of life. Yet clay alone was insufficient. To animate it, something more was required. That requirement introduced a boundary the gods had never crossed before, the death of one of their own. A god associated with intelligence and understanding was chosen, his blood and flesh, becoming the catalyst that would bind divine essence to earthly matter. The sacrifice was procedural, described without drama, which makes it more disturbing. The blood was mixed with clay so that the resulting being would carry not only physical strength, but awareness. Conscious laborers are more effective than mindless ones. This act redefined existence itself. Mortality, once unknown among the divine, became a tool. The spirit called Etemu did not vanish with death but transferred, embedding itself within the new creation. Humans would think because a god had thought. They would feel because a god had felt. And embedded within that inheritance was the memory of rebellion, because the sacrificed god had been among those who resisted. Multiple beings were formed simultaneously, gestated within divine wombs, a process carefully counted month by month. The number mattered. 14 births, balanced between male and female, signaled intention rather than accident. This was not the origin of a single pair, but the deployment of a workforce. Once formed, these beings were placed within the enclosed space of the Edin. There they could be observed. Could they follow instructions? Could they sustain themselves? Could they reproduce without divine intervention? The garden functioned as a testing ground, a controlled environment where variables could be limited and outcomes measured. What none of the planners fully accounted for was the consequence of mixing rebellion with obedience, awareness with servitude. The same consciousness that allowed the Lulu to work efficiently also allowed it to notice injustice, to question boundaries, to imagine alternatives. The experiment solved one problem while quietly creating another. The Eden that emerges from these oldest layers of memory is not a lost paradise but an origin point of tension. It is the place where labor, consciousness and control intersected for the first time. A place designed to stabilize the cosmos, yet seeded with the very instability that would later force the gods to intervene again on a scale far more destructive than a labor strike. The flood, when it came, would not erase humanity by accident. It would be an attempt to correct what the first experiment had set in motion. Creation did not end when the first workers opened their eyes. In the Mesopotamian memory, that moment marked only the transition from design to evaluation. A tool is not judged by how it looks on the workbench, but by how it performs under pressure, and pressure was abundant in the world the new beings were meant to inhabit. The rivers still surged, the soil still demanded shaping. The gods waited to see whether the burden they had transferred would remain stable or begin to crack under its own weight. The earliest humans were not released into an open landscape. They were contained. The enclosure, later remembered as Edin, functioned like a monitored zone, a place where behavior could be observed without interference. This idea of containment was not foreign to Mesopotamian thought. Temples themselves were enclosed spaces within courtyards and restricted rooms, each layer separating common access from sacred control. The Edin followed the same logic. Its boundaries were not decorative, they were operational. Inside this space, humans learned routines. They tended plants, managed water, followed cycles, dictated by instruction rather than instinct. Agriculture here was not discovery, but assignment. The knowledge required to make grain grow in saline soil, to guide water without flooding fields, did not emerge spontaneously. It was taught. This is where another layer of the story surfaces, one that shifts the focus from creation to instruction. The texts speak of figures who did not rule like kings nor work like laborers. They taught. Known as the Apkallu, often translated as the wise ones, these beings occupied an ambiguous position between gods and humans. Later artists depicted them with human bodies and the skins of fish, a visual shorthand for their connection to the Apsu, the freshwater deep associated with Enki. To ancient eyes, a fish was not merely an animal but a symbol of life emerging from water, a moving sign of fertility and origin. Descriptions of the Apkallu emphasize behavior over appearance. They emerged from the sea at dawn, spoke with humans during the day, and returned to the water at night. They did not eat human food, reinforcing their otherness. Their purpose was clear: to transmit knowledge. They taught how to lay bricks in straight lines, how to align structures with celestial patterns, how to establish laws that outlived individual rulers. Civilization, in this telling, was installed rather than invented. Instruction implies deficiency. The humans placed in the Edin were capable of labor, but labor without coordination leads to chaos. The Apkallu provided templates, repeating processes until they became habits. This mirrors how apprentices learn a craft, copying gestures before understanding principles. Over time, the knowledge took root, no longer requiring constant supervision. Yet supervision did not vanish entirely. The gods remained attentive to population growth. The Atrahasis makes clear that reproduction was not a side effect, but a requirement. The new workers had to multiply to meet demand. Initially, this seems to have functioned too well. Human numbers increased, and with them came noise, activity, disruption. The texts describe the gods being unable to sleep because of human clamor, a phrase that sounds trivial until one understands its implication. Noise here represents presence. Humanity had become impossible to ignore. This was not the rebellion of the Igigi repeated, but it echoed the same pattern. A system designed to solve one problem created another. Overpopulation strained resources, fields were overworked, water systems clogged. The gods responded not with immediate destruction, but with corrective measures. Droughts were sent, then famine, then disease. Each was intended to reduce numbers without eliminating the species entirely. Each failed. Enki, who had designed humanity, consistently intervened to soften these measures. He warned humans, teaching them how to survive famine by storing grain, how to endure drought by rationing water. His actions reveal divided loyalties. He remained committed to the cosmic order, but also to his creation. This tension between control and compassion runs through every layer of the story. Eventually, the solution escalated. The decision was made to wipe the slate clean. A flood would erase the surplus, leaving a manageable remnant. The flood narrative that later traditions preserved did not originate as a moral parable. It was an administrative reset. Humanity had exceeded its parameters. Yet even this was not executed without resistance. Enki again intervened, instructing a human named Atrahasis to build a vessel. The instructions were precise: dimensions, materials, sealing techniques. This was not a miracle boat conjured by faith, but an engineered object designed to survive catastrophe. When the waters receded, humanity persisted, but under new conditions. After the flood, something fundamental changed. The Apkallu no longer appeared as they once had. Later lists distinguish between the antediluvian sages, described as divine, and their successors, who were human descendants. The direct interface between gods and humans had been severed. Knowledge would now pass through tradition rather than instruction. This marked the end of the Edin phase, even if the name lingered in memory. Mortality, too, was formalized. While humans had always been destined to die, post-flood texts emphasize limits more sharply. lifespans shortened. Authority shifted from divine teachers to human kings. The garden, once a controlled environment for development, no longer existed as a physical space. It survived as a memory, reshaped into a story of loss rather than function. One figure stands at the center of this transition, Adapa. Described as a priest of Enki and a model human, Adapa possessed wisdom but not eternal life. His story clarifies what humanity was meant to be after Edin. When offered immortality, Adapa refused, following Enki's warning. This was not ignorance, it was obedience. The choice ensured that humans would remain brilliant yet bounded, capable yet controllable. The pattern is consistent, knowledge is permitted, power is limited, labor is required, immortality is denied. The Edin experiment established these parameters, and every subsequent myth reinforces them. Even the biblical retelling preserves this structure. Humans may eat from the tree of knowledge, but access to the tree of life is barred. Cherubim guard the boundary, replacing the walls of the ancient enclosure. Seen through this lens, the expulsion from Edin is not a punishment for curiosity, but a phase change. Once humans could operate independently, the controlled environment was no longer necessary. They were released into the wider world with instructions encoded in ritual, law, and memory. The gods withdrew not because the experiment failed, but because it had reached a stable configuration. Yet stability does not mean harmony. The divine component embedded in humanity carried unintended consequences. The same awareness that allowed humans to build cities also allowed them to question authority. The memory of rebellion, inherited from the sacrifice god, surfaced in new forms. Kings were challenged, laws were broken, empires rose and fell. The ancient storytellers did not frame this as tragedy or triumph. They presented it as outcome. Humanity existed because work needed to be done. Consciousness was granted because mindless labor was inefficient. Edin was built because uncontrolled development leads to collapse. When Edin ended, the world inherited its legacy, a species capable of reshaping its environment and itself, yet forever negotiating the boundaries imposed by its origin. In this way, the Edin narrative ceases to be a tale about lost innocence. It becomes a record of early systems thinking, preserved in myth because no other language existed to describe it. The garden was not destroyed, it was decommissioned, and the humans who left it carried its design within them long after its walls had vanished beneath silt and time. Memory hardens differently when it is written by survivors. After the floodwaters withdrew and the rivers returned to their channels, the world did not reset to innocence. It reset to caution. The gods had learned that creation could spiral beyond intention, and humanity had learned that existence itself was conditional. The relationship between maker and made entered a new phase, governed less by direct supervision and more by boundaries enforced through distance. The loss of the Apkallu marked this shift with particular clarity. Before the flood, wisdom walked openly among humans. Afterward, it receded into texts, rituals, and bloodlines. Kings claimed descent from the sages, not because they were gods, but because authority now depended on inherited legitimacy rather than direct instruction. Civilization became self-propagating, but also more fragile. Errors could no longer be corrected by divine teachers stepping out of the sea at dawn. This fragility exposed a problem the creators had postponed rather than solved: consciousness. The human mind, enhanced by divine essence, did not remain fixed at the level required for labor. It abstracted, symbolized, remembered, language expanded, stories accumulated. Humans began to interpret their condition, not merely endure it. Myth itself became a side effect of the experiment. One of the most striking features of Mesopotamian mythology is its lack of illusion about this process. The gods are not offended by curiosity. They are threatened by scale. A single human thinking is harmless. Millions thinking together becomes destabilizing. Noise in this context is not sound but activity exceeding thresholds. When humanity multiplied again after the flood, the concern resurfaced, but the response was different. Rather than erasing the species, the gods adjusted parameters. Death became more absolute. Disease more varied. Lifespans shortened dramatically, as recorded in king lists that show a steep decline from antediluvian reigns lasting thousands of years to post-flood kings ruling mere decades. This was not random decay, it was constraint. Shorter lives limited accumulation of experience and power. Knowledge would fragment across generations instead of concentrating indefinitely. Work, too, evolved. Humans were no longer confined to a single enclosure. They spread, carrying techniques taught in Edin-like conditions into diverse environments. As they adapted, they developed local variations. Agriculture changed with climate. Architecture responded to available materials. The gods no longer micromanage these developments. Variability itself became a buffer against systemic failure. Yet one domain remained closely guarded: access to divine status. The boundary between human and God was reinforced repeatedly. Stories emphasize failed attempts to cross it, not as moral lessons but as structural warnings. Gilgamesh, 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, seeks immortality and fails. His failure is not portrayed as punishment for arrogance, but as confirmation of limits. Even exceptional beings are confined. This confinement is most vividly illustrated in the continued control over life-extending knowledge. Plants that restore youth exist, but they are lost. Waters that grant longevity can be reached, but not consumed. Each narrative reinforces the same conclusion. Humans may approach the threshold, but they will not pass it. The experiment required workers, not rivals. Within this framework, Edin transforms into a prototype rather than a destination. Its function was developmental, not eternal. Once humans demonstrated stability outside controlled conditions, the enclosure became obsolete. The guardians placed at its boundary in later retellings symbolize not anger, but quarantine. What was once protected from contamination now protected the wider system from intrusion. Archaeology echoes this transition in unexpected ways. Early settlements show centralized planning, uniform tool styles, and sudden bursts of complexity. Later layers reveal diversification, experimentation, and regional identity. It is as if the initial blueprint loosened over time, allowing humanity to explore variations within imposed constraints. The gods withdrew not because they vanished, but because the system could now sustain itself. Still, withdrawal did not mean absence. Divine influence persisted through omens, dreams, and disasters. Communication shifted from conversation to signal. Humans learned to read the world itself as a message. Floods, eclipses, and plagues were interpreted not as random events but as feedback from the system's architects. This interpretation reinforced obedience without requiring constant oversight. The human response to this distance was religion. Temples replaced gardens as points of contact. Sacrifice replaced instruction as a means of communication. Blood, once used to create humanity, now flowed in offerings intended to maintain favor. This inversion is telling. What began as gods giving substance to humans evolved into humans returning substance to gods. The relationship stabilized around exchange rather than creation. Yet embedded within every ritual was an unspoken memory. Humans were made to work. Labor defined identity. Even kings framed their authority in terms of service to the gods. The language of obligation permeated law codes, prayers, and hymns. Freedom existed, but within a framework that always pointed upward. Despite this, the inherited spark of rebellion never disappeared. It surfaced in subtle ways: skepticism toward rulers, innovation that disrupted tradition, stories that questioned divine justice. Mesopotamian literature contains laments that accuse the gods of indifference, even cruelty. Such texts would be unthinkable in a system of absolute control. They indicate tolerance for dissent, perhaps because dissent was inevitable. The creators had embedded intelligence too deeply to extract it. They could limit lifespan and access, but they could not erase awareness without dismantling the entire design. Humanity was not a machine that could be downgraded without consequences. Consciousness, once introduced, propagated itself. This propagation eventually reframed Eden in human memory. What had been a controlled workspace became a lost ideal. Distance romanticized it. Work became suffering rather than function. Boundaries became exile. The narrative shifted from engineering to ethics, from system management to moral drama. This transformation did not erase the original logic. It obscured it beneath symbolism. Yet traces remain. The insistence that humans were placed in the garden to work. The emphasis on forbidden knowledge rather than forbidden territory. The fear of humans becoming like gods. These elements persist because they encode structural truths. Humanity was always meant to know enough to function, but not enough to transcend. Part 3 of the story is not about creation or instruction, but stabilization. It is about a species learning to operate within limits it did not choose, using tools it did not invent, guided by memories it only partially understood. Eden was no longer accessible, but its architecture remained embedded in human society: hierarchy, labor, law, and the persistent tension between obedience and autonomy. The experiment did not end when the garden closed. It simply scaled up. The world became the new testing ground, and humanity, carrying divine residue and mortal constraints, continued to evolve under watchful distance. The question was no longer whether humans could work. It was whether they could manage themselves without becoming what their creators feared they might one day be. Distance did not dissolve authority. It transformed it. Once the gods withdrew from daily supervision, control migrated into structure. Laws replaced commands. Time replaced presence. Human societies began to mirror the hierarchy of their creators, not because they were instructed to do so explicitly, but because hierarchy had been the environment in which they were formed. What the Edin had imposed physically, civilization would now impose symbolically. Kings emerged as intermediaries, not divine in essence, but elevated in function. The earliest royal inscriptions do not claim godhood, they claim appointment. A king ruled by the word of Enlil or through the wisdom of Enki. Language that frames authority as delegated rather than inherent. This distinction mattered. Delegated power can be revoked. Kings understood themselves as managers of labor, organizers of surplus, and maintainers of order, echoing the original purpose for which humanity itself had been created. Law codes, such as those attributed to Ur-Nammu or Hammurabi, reveal this inheritance clearly. They do not ask whether work should be done, they regulate how it is done and who benefits. Labor is assumed, inequality is normalized, the cosmos is reflected in society. Those at the top decide, those below execute. Justice exists, but within boundaries that protect the system rather than the individual. Temples replaced Eden as controlled spaces. Where the garden once enclosed the first humans, temple complexes now enclose knowledge, wealth, and ritual. Access was tiered, inner sanctuaries were restricted, mirroring the earlier logic of separation. The gods were no longer visible, but their absence was managed through architecture. Walls, gates, and courtyards regulated movement the way divine command once had. Inside these spaces, rituals reenacted creation itself. Clay figurines were shaped and animated through prayer. Blood offerings substituted for the original sacrifice that had made humanity possible. The repetition was not coincidental. By reenacting the origin, humans sought to stabilize their place within it. Sacrifice was not primarily an act of devotion, it was maintenance. The gods had built a system that required input, and sacrifice was how humans supplied it. Dreams became another channel of control. In Mesopotamian belief, dreams were not psychological artifacts, but messages transmitted when the conscious mind was least defended. Kings consulted dream interpreters the way earlier humans had consulted the Apkallu. Instructions now arrived encoded, symbolic, requiring specialists to decode them. This added another layer of mediation, reinforcing hierarchy while preserving the illusion of divine engagement. Despite these mechanisms, unpredictability persisted. Floods returned, empires collapsed, plagues spread without warning. Each disruption tested the assumption that the system was stable. When disasters struck, the question was not whether the gods existed, but whether humans had failed to maintain the terms of their creation. Guilt replaced curiosity as the dominant explanatory framework. This shift reframed rebellion. Where the Igigi had revolted openly, humans internalized dissent. Resistance became subtle, embedded in myth, poetry, and irony. Stories of trickster gods and clever mortals circulated, celebrating intelligence that bent rules without breaking them outright. Enki himself embodied this ambiguity, both architect of order and frequent subverter of divine decrees. Humans inherited not only his ingenuity but his duplicity. Language evolved to accommodate this tension. Words for work, service, and worship overlapped. To serve the gods and to labor in the fields were linguistically linked. This fusion blurred the boundary between sacred and mundane. Every act of labor became ritualized, reinforcing obedience through meaning. When work is sacred, refusal becomes heresy. Yet heresy did not disappear. It transformed into philosophy. Questions about justice, suffering, and divine indifference began to surface in texts like the Babylonian Theodicy. These works do not deny the gods, they interrogate them. The very existence of such texts suggests a controlled tolerance. As long as questioning remained intellectual rather than operational, the system could absorb it. The memory of Eden lingered as a benchmark against which present conditions were measured. It was remembered not as comfort, but as clarity. In Eden, purpose had been explicit. Outside it, humans had to infer their role from fragmented signals. This ambiguity generated anxiety but also creativity. Art, music, and literature flourished as ways of negotiating meaning within imposed limits. Archaeological layers show this negotiation materially. Early standardized tools gave way to specialized crafts. Pottery diversified. Seals became intricate, encoding identity and authority in miniature scenes. Writing itself expanded from accounting to narrative. What began as a tool for managing labor evolved into a medium for preserving memory and dissent. Writing is particularly revealing in this context. Cuneiform began as marks pressed into clay to track grain and workers. Over time, those same wedges recorded prayers, myths, and debates. The material of creation became the material of reflection. Clay, once mixed with divine blood to form humans, now received impressions of human thought. The symmetry is difficult to ignore. Through writing, humans externalized memory, reducing dependence on divine recall. This shift subtly altered the balance of power. Knowledge stored in tablets could be consulted without dreams or omens. Libraries replaced oracles. The gods had given humanity intelligence. Humanity used it to build continuity independent of divine presence. Still, boundaries held. Immortality remained inaccessible. Attempts to bypass death through monuments, names, and lineage reflect this frustration. Kings built ziggurats not to reach the heavens physically, but to assert permanence symbolically. These structures were mountains of brick, artificial peaks in flat land, mimicking the cosmic mountain where gods were believed to dwell. They did not grant eternity, but they gestured toward it. The persistence of death reinforced urgency. Short lives demanded productivity. Generations overlapped just enough to transmit knowledge, but not enough to consolidate power indefinitely. This churn benefited the system. No single human could accumulate experience rivaling a god's. Mortality was not a flaw, it was a safeguard. Seen from this angle, Edin was less about origin and more about calibration. It established baseline parameters: intelligence sufficient for labor, reproduction sufficient for sustainability, lifespan short enough to prevent dominance. Everything that followed adjusted these parameters without violating them. Even catastrophe operated within limits. By the time later cultures inherited these stories, the technical logic had faded, replaced by moral interpretation. Obedience became virtue, disobedience became sin. Yet beneath these ethical layers, the structural core remained intact. Humans existed to maintain a world designed by others, using tools and knowledge provided under constraint. Part 4 reveals the long shadow of Edin, not as nostalgia, but as architecture. The garden's walls dissolved, but its design principles embedded themselves in cities, laws, and minds. Humanity learned to govern itself the way it had been governed, replicating the original hierarchy at every scale. What had been an experiment became a civilization, still bounded by decisions made at the very beginning, when work was the problem and humanity was the answer. Control is most effective when it no longer feels imposed. By the time human societies matured beyond their earliest cities, the mechanisms first tested in Edin had become internalized. People no longer needed walls to define boundaries. Belief performed that function. The enclosure moved from geography into psychology. What had once been supervised space became assumed order. This transition can be traced through how humans understood fate. In Mesopotamian thought, fate was not abstract destiny but allocation. The term implied assignment, the same way tasks had once been assigned in the garden. Every person was believed to receive a portion, a role within the larger system. Fate was recorded by the gods, but executed by humans. This belief discouraged resistance not through fear, but through inevitability. One does not rebel against an assignment that feels cosmically fixed. Astrology emerged as a refinement of this logic. The movements of celestial bodies were not worshipped for beauty. They were read as schedules. Planets became administrators of time, signaling when to plant, when to wage war, when to wait. The sky functioned like a control panel, distant yet authoritative. Humans learned to align their actions with these signals, further reducing the need for direct divine intervention. Temples institutionalized this alignment. Priests were not merely religious figures, they were technicians of meaning. They interpreted omens, maintained calendars, and regulated rituals that synchronized society with perceived cosmic rhythms. Their authority rested not on force but on expertise. This mirrored the role once held by the Apkallu, though filtered through human institutions. As generations passed, the memory of a time when gods walked openly among humans receded. What remained were stories, increasingly symbolic. Edin transformed again, this time into a moral reference point. Work, once the explicit purpose of creation, was reframed as burden. The labor humanity had been designed for began to feel like punishment rather than function. This reframing was subtle but profound. Suffering demanded explanation. If humans were created to work, why did work hurt? If the gods had engineered the system, why was it unjust? Myth answered by shifting blame. Disobedience replaced design as the cause of hardship. The burden of labor was no longer structural, it was moral. Humans worked because they had failed, not because they had been made to. This reinterpretation served a stabilizing role. If suffering resulted from past error, then obedience promised relief, even if that relief never fully arrived. Hope became another control mechanism, projecting resolution into an undefined future. The system no longer needed to justify itself, it needed only to defer satisfaction. Yet cracks appeared. Wisdom literature, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, questioned this arrangement. Gilgamesh's journey is not about sin, but about limits. He does not seek forgiveness, he seeks escape from death. His failure underscores the permanence of constraints established long before his birth. The lesson is not humility before moral law, but acceptance of structural reality. Friendship, grief, and memory take center stage in this narrative, suggesting that meaning must be constructed within boundaries rather than beyond them. Gilgamesh returns to his city wiser, but still mortal, tasked with ruling well rather than transcending. This outcome reinforces the post-Eden condition. Humans may seek understanding, but not exemption. The gods themselves appear constrained by their own system. They argue, regret, and negotiate, indicating that even creators operate within limits. When Enki repeatedly subverts decrees to protect humans, he reveals that the system's rigidity is not absolute. Flexibility exists, but it is costly and rare. Order remains the priority. This dynamic shapes how punishment is portrayed. Disasters are not framed as cruelty but as correction. Floods, famines, and plagues recalibrate populations and behaviors. They are not random acts of wrath, they are feedback mechanisms. The language used to describe them often mirrors technical failure rather than moral outrage. The system has been stressed beyond tolerance and must be reset. Humans absorbing this worldview learn to think in terms of balance. Excess became dangerous, ambition required justification. Even joy was moderated by ritual. Festivals existed not to escape work, but to mark its rhythm. Rest was permitted, but only within prescribed intervals. Time itself became regulated. Writing reinforced this regulation. As record-keeping expanded, so did accountability. Contracts, debts, and obligations were inscribed in clay, making them persistent beyond memory. The permanence of written obligation mirrored the permanence of fate. One could not easily escape what was impressed into clay, just as one could not escape what had been impressed into human nature. The irony is that writing also preserved dissent. Complaints, laments, and satirical texts survived because the same system that demanded documentation allowed critique to be archived. This suggests confidence in the system's resilience. A structure secure in its foundations can tolerate questioning. Over centuries, these layers accumulated, obscuring the original logic of creation beneath cultural sediment. Edin became distant, mythic, simplified, yet its core features persisted. Work as destiny, knowledge as controlled access, immortality as forbidden. These elements reappear across cultures that inherited Mesopotamian frameworks, even when stripped of their original names. When later traditions retold the Edin story, they emphasized choice and consequence, framing humanity's condition as self-inflicted. This interpretation softened the unsettling implication that humans had been engineered for labor. Responsibility shifted inward, the system absolved itself. Still, echoes remain in language and ritual. To serve God and to work the land remain linguistically intertwined. The sacred and the productive blur. Salvation is promised, but rarely defined in material terms. It exists outside history, beyond reach, maintaining the present order by deferring resolution. Part 5 exposes the long-term success of the Edin experiment, not in biological terms, but cultural ones. Humanity did not merely accept its role, it rationalized it, moralized it, and transmitted it across generations. The enclosure no longer needed walls. It lived in stories, calendars, laws, and expectations. What began as a response to divine exhaustion matured into a civilization that could sustain itself without constant oversight. The gods receded, not defeated, but satisfied that the parameters held. Humanity continued to work, to question, to hope, all within a framework established at the very beginning when the solution to a labor problem became a species. When systems endure long enough, they stop being recognized as systems. They become reality itself. By the era when Mesopotamian myths were copied, edited, and inherited by neighboring cultures, the original logic of creation had faded into background assumption. Humans no longer asked why the world required their labor, they asked how best to endure it. The design had succeeded to the point of invisibility. Yet invisibility does not mean absence. The structure revealed itself most clearly in moments of stress when order faltered and the underlying framework became visible again. Crisis exposes architecture. Famine, invasion, and internal collapse peeled back the layers of belief and revealed the same ancient priorities: stability over compassion, continuity over individual life. One of the most revealing indicators of this priority is how kingship responded to catastrophe. When disaster struck, rulers did not apologize to their people. They sought reconciliation with the gods. Rituals intensified, temples received greater offerings. The assumption was clear: failure originated at the top of the cosmic hierarchy, not at the level of human governance. Kings were managers, not architects. Their role was to realign, not redesign. This mindset limited innovation in social structure but encouraged innovation in technique. If the system itself was unquestionable, efficiency within it became paramount. Agriculture advanced, tools improved, accounting grew complex. Humans refined the means of labor without challenging its necessity. This distinction mirrors the original creation logic. The problem was not work itself, but who had to perform it. Over time, labor diversified. Specialists emerged, scribes, artisans, merchants, each fulfilling a niche that reduced strain on the whole. This diversification did not dismantle hierarchy, it reinforced it. Specialization created dependency. No one could survive alone. Interdependence replaced direct coercion as the glue holding society together. Education reflected this shift. Knowledge was transmitted through apprenticeship, controlled by guilds or temples. Access was limited. Literacy was power, and power remained concentrated. Writing, once a tool for managing grain, became a gatekeeper of authority. Those who could read and write mediated between the visible world and the invisible order encoded in texts. This mediation echoed the earlier role of the Apkallu, now fully humanized. Priests and scribes inherited their function without their ambiguity. They no longer emerged from the sea, they emerged from schools. The mystique diminished, but control persisted. Knowledge was sacred not because it was divine, but because it maintained order. Meanwhile, the human body itself became a site of regulation. Work schedules shaped daily rhythms, diets were ritualized, sexuality was constrained through law and custom to ensure predictable reproduction. The same concern that had driven the gods to create humanity, to stabilize labor, now drove humans to regulate themselves. Disease illustrates this internalization vividly. Illness was interpreted as imbalance, often linked to ritual failure or moral lapse. Healing combined practical remedies with incantations, reinforcing the idea that health depended on alignment with cosmic order. Even biology was framed as compliance. Despite this, human creativity persisted. Art, music, and storytelling flourished within constraints. These expressions did not overthrow the system, they softened it. They provided relief without release. Festivals allowed temporary suspension of norms, after which order resumed, strengthened by contrast. The system learned to vent pressure without rupturing. Myth evolved accordingly. Stories grew more complex, less literal. The gods became distant, sometimes capricious, sometimes sympathetic. Humans gained depth as characters. This narrative evolution did not signal rebellion, it signaled adaptation. As direct memory of Edin faded, metaphor took over. Yet certain motifs remained stubbornly consistent. The idea that humans were shaped from Earth but animated by something beyond it. The insistence that knowledge carries risk. The fear that humans might become too much like their creators. These themes recur across cultures precisely because they encode structural truths rather than historical events. The biblical adaptation of Eden illustrates this transformation clearly. The technical process of creation is replaced by moral symbolism. The garden becomes a test of obedience rather than a site of production. The tree of knowledge replaces instruction. The expulsion becomes punishment rather than decommissioning. Yet the outcome is identical. Humans leave the controlled space to labor in a resistant world. The persistence of this pattern suggests that later, authors inherited not just stories, but assumptions. Work is unavoidable. Knowledge is double-edged. Immortality is forbidden. Authority is external. These assumptions survived because they matched lived experience shaped by the original system. Resistance to these assumptions took philosophical rather than practical form. Questions about justice, fate, and suffering multiplied. Thinkers explored whether the gods were fair, whether destiny could be altered, whether wisdom justified pain. These debates did not dismantle the system, they enriched its internal dialogue. The enclosure had become conceptual. What changed most dramatically was scale. Human populations grew beyond anything the original creators could have anticipated. Cities expanded into empires, trade networks spanned continents. The system designed to manage labor now managed millions. This expansion strained old myths requiring reinterpretation to maintain relevance. In response, abstraction increased. Gods became principles, rituals became symbols. Eden became an idea rather than a place. Yet abstraction did not weaken control, it generalized it. When a rule becomes an idea, it applies everywhere. The original Eden experiment thus achieved a form of immortality denied to humans. It persisted not as a location, but as a framework embedded in culture. Humans continued to reproduce, work, question, and die within parameters set at their origin, rarely perceiving them as imposed. Part 6 reveals a paradox. The more distant the gods became, the more deeply their design penetrated human life. Absence forced internalization. Without visible overseers, humans became their own wardens, enforcing norms through belief, habit, and fear of disorder. The garden's walls were gone, but its logic endured. Humanity moved freely across the earth, yet remained confined by invisible boundaries, mortality, obligation, hierarchy, and the persistent sense that existence itself was conditional. The experiment no longer required supervision. It had become self-sustaining, carried forward by those it was designed to contain. Self-sustaining systems eventually forget their origin, but traces resurface when pressure builds beyond tolerance. By the time humanity entered periods of large-scale conflict and empire, the inherited framework from Eden began producing side effects the original designers had not planned for. Efficiency increased, order expanded, yet meaning thinned. Work remained central, but purpose fragmented. Empires magnified the original hierarchy. Where the gods once ruled over humans and humans over nature, empires stacked these layers repeatedly. Kings ruled subjects, governors ruled cities, officials ruled households. Authority cascaded downward, while responsibility diffused upward. This architecture echoed the cosmic model with uncanny precision. The Anunnaki no longer needed to intervene. Humanity replicated their structure instinctively. Yet scale introduced distortion. In smaller systems, labor connected visibly to outcome. Fields produced grain. Canals delivered water. In empires, labor became abstract. A worker no longer saw the result of effort, only the demand for it. This abstraction intensified alienation, a condition already seeded in Eden when work was assigned rather than chosen. Myths began reflecting this estrangement. Stories emphasized loss, exile, and unreachable ideals. The past became golden, the present burdensome, the future uncertain. Eden shifted again in memory, now representing not a system, but a longing for simplicity, for clarity, for a world where purpose was visible rather than implied. This longing did not dismantle labor, it aestheticized it. Hardship became virtuous. Endurance became moral capital. Suffering acquired meaning because meaning was otherwise scarce. Religious traditions absorbed this transformation, presenting work as trial and patience as salvation. The original function of labor to replace divine exhaustion was now fully obscured. At the same time, technological progress accelerated. Tools extended human capacity, allowing fewer people to produce more. This efficiency should have reduced labor, but instead it raised expectations. Surplus enabled expansion, expansion demanded administration, and administration required labor of a different kind. The system adapted by redefining work rather than eliminating it. Writing became central to this adaptation. Bureaucracy expanded, turning human activity into data. Tablets, scrolls, and later manuscripts recorded transactions, taxes, obligations. Humans were no longer merely workers, they were entries. Identity flattened into function. This mirrored the earliest conception of humanity as Lulu, defined by purpose rather than individuality. Yet individuality persisted in resistance. Personal names, family histories, and local traditions survived beneath imperial uniformity. Stories were told in kitchens and marketplaces that contradicted official narratives. Humor, satire, and folklore carried subversive insights. These expressions did not overthrow the system, but they prevented total erasure of human nuancing. Philosophical traditions emerged to grapple with these tensions. Thinkers questioned whether fate was fixed or negotiable, whether gods cared or merely governed. Some proposed withdrawal from society as a solution, minimizing participation in the labor machine. Others embraced duty, finding dignity in service. Both responses operated within the same constraints, offering coping strategies rather than escape. The concept of salvation evolved accordingly. No longer tied to physical spaces like Edin, it became temporal or transcendent. Relief was promised after death, beyond history. This promise redirected dissatisfaction away from present structures. If fulfillment awaited elsewhere, the current system could persist unchallenged. Mortality played a crucial role in maintaining this redirection. Short lives discouraged long-term rebellion. Memory reset every generation. Knowledge had to be relearned, struggles repeated. Even when patterns were recognized, there was rarely time to alter them meaningfully. The design held, yet cracks widened. Repeated cycles of rise and collapse exposed systemic fragility. Empires fell under their own weight. Resource depletion mirrored the earlier problem of divine exhaustion. Humans now faced a version of the same dilemma: too much work, too many demands, too little relief. This parallel is striking. Humanity had inherited not only the task of labor, but the conditions that made labor unbearable. The gods solved their crisis by creating humans. Humans could not replicate this solution without ethical collapse. Slavery and exploitation proliferated instead, echoing the original transfer of burden in distorted form. Religion responded by moralizing inequality. Hierarchies were framed as natural or divinely ordained. This narrative stabilized society but intensified resentment. Revolts erupted periodically, often invoking divine justice against corrupt rulers. These revolts mirrored the Igigi rebellion in structure, though stripped of cosmic scale. Each uprising was met with reform or repression, rarely with systemic change. The framework adjusted but endured. History became cyclical, repeating patterns with variations. The original Edin experiment echoed through time, its logic resurfacing whenever labor overwhelmed meaning. By this stage, Edin functioned primarily as mythic contrast. It symbolized lost harmony, even though such harmony had never existed. The reinterpretation was complete. What began as a controlled workspace was remembered as paradise. This inversion reveals how thoroughly the technical origin had been forgotten. Yet the inversion itself served a function. By imagining a lost perfection, societies justified present suffering as temporary deviation. Restoration replaced redesign as the goal. This orientation preserved the system by framing dissatisfaction as nostalgia rather than critique. Part 7 exposes the long-term psychological cost of a species designed to work. When labor detaches from visible purpose, it demands symbolic compensation. Myths, religions, and philosophies filled that gap, providing narratives strong enough to sustain obedience without clarity. The experiment that began in Edin had succeeded too well. Humanity no longer recognized work as imposed, it recognized it as existence. Even resistance adopted the language of duty and destiny. The enclosure no longer needed walls, gods, or guardians. It lived inside expectation itself. And yet within that expectation, the same spark endured, the inherited awareness that something about the arrangement was provisional. The memory was faint, distorted, but persistent. It surfaced whenever humans imagined a world different from the one they were born into. That imagination, however constrained, remained the one variable the system had never fully controlled. Imagination is the last domain that resists full regulation. As long as humans can envision alternatives, the system that governs them remains incomplete. By the time later civilizations absorbed the Eden narrative into theology, imagination had become both a refuge and a threat. It offered escape from present constraints, but it also carried the risk of reawakening questions the original design had sought to contain. This tension surfaced most clearly in how humans conceptualized knowledge. Early instruction in Eden had been practical: how to work, how to maintain, how to obey cycles. Over time, knowledge expanded beyond function into speculation. Astronomy became cosmology. Accounting evolved into mathematics. Observation turned into theory. The mind began operating beyond immediate necessity. The danger of this expansion was recognized early. Knowledge had always been double-edged. It increased efficiency, but it also fostered independence. A worker who understands the system may begin to question why it exists. This is why later traditions framed certain knowledge as forbidden or dangerous. The warning was not about morality, it was about control. The biblical image of the tree of knowledge captures this perfectly. Eating from it does not kill immediately, it awakens perception. Nakedness, a metaphor for vulnerability and awareness, becomes visible. Humans recognize themselves as separate entities rather than components of a process. This recognition marks a psychological exit from Eden long before any physical expulsion. What follows is telling. Once awareness emerges, continued containment becomes impossible. The response is separation. Humans are sent out not because they have failed, but because they have changed. A system designed for compliant labor cannot accommodate self-aware agents indefinitely. The enclosure is no longer suitable. Outside the garden, knowledge continues to grow, but under harsher conditions. Work becomes survival rather than assignment. The ground resists cultivation. Pain accompanies reproduction. These elements are often read as punishment, but structurally they function as recalibration. Increased difficulty absorbs surplus awareness, redirecting cognitive energy back into endurance. This recalibration mirrors earlier divine responses to overpopulation and noise. When humanity exceeded parameters, stressors were introduced. Scarcity replaced abundance, effort replaced ease. The system reasserted balance not by removing knowledge, but by overwhelming it with necessity. As civilizations advanced, they learned to mitigate these stresses through technology and organization. Irrigation reduced scarcity, medicine reduced pain, education reduced uncertainty. Each mitigation reopened the question of limits. If suffering decreases, awareness resurfaces. If awareness grows, control weakens. The cycle repeats. This dynamic explains the recurring appearance of apocalyptic narratives. When systems grow too efficient, too stable, too comfortable, stories emerge predicting collapse and renewal. These narratives function as pressure valves, reintroducing uncertainty and humility. They remind humanity that stability is conditional. Apocalyptic imagery often includes gardens, floods, or returns to primordial states. These symbols recall Eden not as history but as template. Destruction promises reset, reset promises clarity. The longing is not for pleasure but for defined purpose. Chaos is frightening, but ambiguity is worse. Philosophical movements responded differently. Some embraced asceticism, deliberately limiting desire and comfort to preserve awareness without threatening order. Others pursued enlightenment, seeking inner freedom while outwardly conforming. Both approaches accept the constraints of the system while attempting to reclaim autonomy internally. Religion adapted by shifting emphasis from external obedience to internal state. Sin became thought as much as action. Salvation became belief as much as behavior. This internalization deepened control while offering personal meaning. The enclosure tightened, but it felt voluntary. Yet even voluntary enclosure breeds contradiction. When belief conflicts with experience, doubt arises. Doubt, once internalized, becomes quiet rebellion. It does not march on temples or burn tools. It lingers, eroding certainty over time. The system tolerates doubt because it is slow and diffuse. Science later amplified this erosion. By explaining phenomena once attributed to divine will, it reduced reliance on myth. Yet science also reinforced the original framework by increasing productivity and extending control over nature. Humans became more capable workers than ever, even as they questioned the reason for work. This paradox defines the modern inheritance of Eden. Humanity possesses unprecedented knowledge and power, yet remains bound by structures of labor, mortality, and hierarchy. The gods may no longer be named, but the system persists through economics, politics, and social expectation. Eden survives here as metaphor for lost alignment. People speak of finding purpose or returning to simplicity, echoing ancient longings without recalling their source. Work is still central but increasingly abstract. Many labor without seeing outcome, repeating the alienation that first emerged when humanity left the controlled space. Technology intensifies this condition. Automation promises relief from labor, but often delivers displacement instead. The question resurfaces: if work defined humanity's purpose, what happens when work diminishes? The original design offers no answer. It assumed perpetual necessity. This uncertainty revives the oldest fear of the gods, a humanity no longer occupied. Idle awareness is unpredictable. Without labor to absorb cognition, imagination expands unchecked. The system compensates by inventing new forms of work, new obligations, new distractions. Attention becomes the new resource to manage. Part 8 reveals that Eden was never about innocence. It was about alignment between capacity and demand. As long as human capability matched assigned purpose, stability held. When capability exceeded purpose, tension arose. Every major shift in history could be read as an attempt to resolve this imbalance. The garden's true legacy is not exclusion, but calibration. Humanity has been adjusting to its own awareness ever since, oscillating between expansion and constraint. The experiment did not fail, but it never concluded. Its outcome remains provisional, unfolding with each generation that inherits the same question. What does a species designed to work become when it understands why it was made? Awareness, once awakened, does not retreat quietly. It adapts, disguises itself, and waits for conditions that allow it to surface again. As humanity moved further from the remembered structure of Eden, the question of purpose did not disappear. It fragmented. Instead of asking why humans were made, societies began asking what humans should become. This subtle shift marked a turning point. Purpose was no longer inherited, it had to be constructed. This construction took many forms, but all of them operated within inherited limits. Humans could redefine meaning but not remove labor. They could reinterpret destiny but not escape mortality. The system's boundaries remained fixed, even as the stories explaining them evolved. What changed was the locus of responsibility. Meaning became a human project. Philosophical traditions across cultures converged on this realization independently. In Mesopotamia, wisdom literature accepted uncertainty as permanent. In later Greek thought, purpose was sought through virtue rather than obedience. In Eastern traditions, harmony replaced hierarchy as the organizing principle. Despite surface differences, all assumed the same baseline. Existence required effort, and effort required justification. This convergence suggests that the Edin framework had already done its work. By embedding labor into the definition of life, it ensured that any search for meaning would take place within exertion rather than leisure. Even philosophies that rejected material ambition emphasized discipline, restraint, and practice. The form changed, the function remained. Religion responded by deepening narrative complexity. Heaven and hell, reward and punishment, reincarnation and judgment emerged as ways to contextualize effort beyond immediate results. Work in one life could pay off in another. Suffering could be retroactively justified. These systems extended the horizon of meaning without altering daily structure. The persistence of this approach reveals its utility. A species that must work to exist benefits from believing that work contributes to something larger. Whether that something is divine order, moral improvement, or cosmic balance matters less than the belief itself. Belief stabilizes behavior. Yet belief systems themselves require maintenance. Rituals must be repeated, texts must be interpreted, authorities must be recognized. Each layer adds labor of its own. The system grows self-reinforcing, consuming energy to justify the consumption of energy. At scale, this creates complexity that feels necessary but often obscures origin. When complexity becomes overwhelming, simplification movements arise. Reformers strip away ritual, critique institutions, and call for return to fundamentals. These movements often invoke Eden-like imagery, purity, origin, uncorrupted truth. They promise liberation from accumulated burden by recovering an imagined beginning. Ironically, these reforms rarely reduce labor, they reallocate it. New disciplines replace old ones, new hierarchies replace discredited authorities. The system sheds weight only to grow again. The enclosure reshapes itself without dissolving. The modern era intensified this pattern. Industrialization redefined work, detaching it further from natural cycles. Machines absorbed physical strain, but mental strain increased. Time became segmented, measured, sold. Labor was no longer seasonal or communal. It became continuous and individual. The abstraction first glimpsed in empires reached its peak. This shift exposed a contradiction. If work defined human purpose and machines reduced the need for human work, then purpose itself became unstable. Societies responded by expanding consumption. Desire replaced necessity as motivator. Humans worked not just to survive, but to acquire symbols of status and identity. This expansion did not resolve the underlying tension, it displaced it. Work became about maintaining lifestyle rather than sustaining life. Alienation deepened. The system required constant stimulation to keep participants engaged. Entertainment industries emerged as parallel structures to absorb excess awareness. Education adapted accordingly. Instead of transmitting stable knowledge for defined roles, it prepared humans for perpetual adjustment. Flexibility replaced mastery. The expectation was no longer to fit into a fixed assignment, but to remain employable within shifting demands. This adaptability echoes the original design's emphasis on function over form. Despite these changes, mortality remained unchanged. Death continued to impose urgency, even as life expectancy increased. The awareness of finite time sharpened the question of meaning. If work consumed most of life and life ended regardless of effort, what justified the arrangement? Responses diverged. Some embraced nihilism, rejecting imposed meaning altogether. Others doubled down on productivity, treating output as legacy. Still others sought escape through altered consciousness, temporarily dissolving boundaries imposed by the system. Each response reveals dissatisfaction with inherited constraints. Technology once again plays a dual role. It promises liberation from labor through automation, yet introduces new forms of dependency and surveillance. The same tools that reduce effort increase control. Data replaces clay tablets, but the logic remains. Humans are tracked, categorized, optimized. This optimization mirrors the original impulse behind creation, efficiency. The gods sought efficient workers. Modern systems seek efficient participants. The language has changed, but the goal persists. When efficiency becomes an end rather than a means, humanity risks becoming abstract again, reduced to metrics. Yet resistance persists. Movements advocating rest, balance, and redefinition of success challenge the assumption that constant labor is natural. These movements often invoke well-being rather than rebellion, but their implications are radical. If humans are not defined by work, the foundation of the system weakens. Part 9 brings the Edin experiment into the present. It reveals a through line from divine labor crisis to modern burnout. The conditions have changed, but the pattern remains. Awareness expands, systems adapt to contain it, and humans negotiate meaning within constraint. The experiment's unresolved question now belongs to humanity itself. If humans were created to work, but have outgrown the necessity that justified their creation, what comes next? The answer is not yet written. The enclosure persists, but its walls are thinning, not because they are attacked, but because awareness continues to press outward, imagining futures that the original design never accounted for. When awareness reaches a certain threshold, it stops asking for permission. It begins to reorganize reality from the inside. This is the phase humanity has entered repeatedly throughout its history, each time under different names, each time confronting the same inherited limits. The Edin framework did not anticipate self-directed redesign, only adaptation within preset boundaries. Yet adaptation, when pushed far enough, becomes transformation. The most destabilizing force in this phase is not rebellion, but reinterpretation. Humans rarely overthrow systems outright. They reinterpret their meaning until the original purpose erodes. Work, once defined as obligation, becomes framed as self-expression. Labor markets adopt the language of passion, fulfillment, and identity. This linguistic shift conceals continuity beneath novelty. People still work to survive, but survival is disguised as choice. Choice, however, introduces accountability. When work is framed as personal expression, dissatisfaction appears as personal failure rather than structural consequence. The system insulates itself by redirecting blame inward. The enclosure tightens not through force, but through identity. To reject the system feels like rejecting oneself. This mechanism mirrors earlier theological strategies. Sin internalized control by turning deviation into guilt. Modern narratives, productivity, internalize control by turning exhaustion into inadequacy. The gods are no longer needed to enforce limits. Ambition performs that role. Humans police themselves. Yet ambition is unstable. It escalates. When fulfillment becomes a mandate, rest becomes suspect. Idleness feels like transgression. This dynamic echoes the original fear that drove creation. Beings with nothing to do become unpredictable. The system ensures perpetual engagement by tying worth to output. Technology accelerates this process. Connectivity eliminates temporal boundaries. Work follows individuals into private spaces, attention fragments. The distinction between labor and leisure dissolves. Humans are no longer merely workers, they are interfaces constantly responding to signals. The garden is no longer physical or symbolic, it is digital, ubiquitous, inescapable. Data replaces ritual as the medium of control. Algorithms learn preferences, predict behavior, and subtly shape choice. This shaping does not coerce, it nudges. The effect is more efficient than command. Behavior aligns with expectation without conscious resistance. The original Edin logic, alignment through design rather than force, reaches a new expression. Yet the same dynamic produces new forms of awareness. Exposure to information collapses mythic distance. Humans recognize patterns once hidden. They see how incentives shape action, how narratives justify inequality, how systems persist by adapting language. This recognition revives the ancient question in modern terms. The question is no longer about gods or gardens, it is about autonomy. Can a species, shaped for function, redefine itself beyond function? Can it sustain meaning without constant exertion? These questions surface in debates about universal income, automation, and post-work futures. They challenge the oldest assumption embedded in humanity's design. Resistance now appears as redefinition of value. Creativity, care, and presence are proposed as alternatives to productivity. These proposals threaten the system not by confrontation but by reframing success. If worth is decoupled from output, the rationale for constant labor weakens. The system responds predictably. New forms of work emerge to absorb these values. Creativity becomes industry. Care becomes service economy. Presence becomes performance. Each alternative is monetized, reintegrated, and regulated. The enclosure expands to include its own critique. This pattern demonstrates the resilience of the Edin framework. It does not break under challenge, it incorporates challenge as fuel. Dissent generates innovation, innovation increases efficiency, efficiency stabilizes the system, the cycle repeats, mortality continues to anchor this cycle. Awareness of limited time intensifies desire for significance, work offers measurable legacy. Even when individuals reject traditional careers, they often seek impact through other metrics. The drive to leave a mark replaces the drive to obey, but the effect is similar, sustained engagement. Yet cracks widen as ecological limits become undeniable. The Earth itself shows signs of exhaustion, mirroring the divine fatigue that initiated creation. Resources deplete, climate destabilizes. The planet exhibits symptoms of overwork. Humanity faces a reflection of its own origin story, now on a planetary scale. This parallel is unsettling. The gods created humans to offload labor onto the Earth and its inhabitants. Humans have now offloaded their labor onto the planet itself, extracting until systems strain. The same logic that produced Edin now threatens collapse. The pattern has scaled beyond its initial context. Responses to this crisis echo earlier adjustments. Calls for restraint, balance, and return to harmony proliferate. Once again, Eden-like imagery surfaces: gardens, stewardship, restoration. The desire is not for progress, but recalibration. Humanity senses that the parameters have been exceeded. The difference now is agency. Unlike the gods, humanity cannot create a new species to bear the burden. It must confront its own design. This confrontation challenges the deepest assumption inherited from Eden, that existence requires constant extraction of effort from something else. Part 10 marks the moment when the experiment turns inward. Humanity stands where the Anunnaki once stood, facing exhaustion and imbalance. The solution can no longer be displacement. It must be transformation or collapse. The old narratives offer no clear guidance here. They were written to justify work, not to transcend it. New stories must emerge, capable of sustaining meaning without perpetual strain. Whether humanity can write such stories remains uncertain. The Eden framework persists, but it is under unprecedented pressure. Awareness has expanded beyond containment, technology has amplified capacity beyond control, and the planet itself resists further extraction. The system that once solved a labor crisis now faces its mirror image. What happens next will determine whether the experiment concludes, evolves, or repeats itself in another form. Humanity is no longer merely the product of a design. It has become its executor, inheriting not only the role of worker, but the responsibility of architect. Inheritance is most dangerous when it is unconscious. Humanity did not merely inherit tools, myths, and institutions from its origin. It inherited assumptions about what existence is for. These assumptions operate beneath ideology, beneath belief, shaping behavior even when their source is forgotten. By the time humanity reached a point where it could influence planetary systems, the Eden framework had fully merged with identity itself. One of the clearest signs of this merger is how progress is defined. Progress is almost universally measured as increased productivity, expanded control, and accelerated output. Even when framed as humanitarian or ethical advancement, it is quantified through efficiency. Lives saved, hours reduced, growth sustained. The language of metrics reveals the underlying logic. Value is still tied to function. This logic governs not only economies, but personal lives. People measure worth through achievement, accumulation, and optimization. Time is segmented, managed, and evaluated. Rest must justify itself. Leisure must be productive. Even self-care becomes task-oriented, tracked and assessed. The original enclosure has become intimate. Yet beneath this relentless optimization lies fatigue, structural, collective fatigue. Burnout is not an individual failure, it is a systemic symptom. It mirrors the exhaustion of the Igigi, not in form but in function. Too much demand, too little meaning, no clear endpoint. The difference is that modern fatigue lacks a clear authority to confront. There is no Enlil to surround, no divine assembly to petition. Instead, exhaustion diffuses, it becomes normalized. People adapt by lowering expectations, numbing awareness, or retreating into distraction. These coping mechanisms stabilize the system in the short term while eroding engagement in the long term. A disengaged worker still functions, but without belief. The system persists, hollowed. This hollowness revives ancient questions in new forms. If work no longer guarantees stability, and stability no longer guarantees fulfillment, what sustains participation? The answer increasingly lies in narrative rather than outcome. Stories of impact, legacy, and transformation replace tangible reward. The system runs on belief again. Belief, however, is fragile in an age of visibility. Information exposes contradictions rapidly. Disparities between promise and reality are documented, shared, and amplified. The enclosure struggles to maintain coherence when its justifications are publicly contested. Control shifts from consensus to fragmentation. Fragmentation produces polarization. Competing narratives vie for allegiance, each offering different interpretations of purpose. Some double down on productivity, others reject it entirely. Some seek technological transcendence, imagining escape from biological limits. Others seek regression, idealizing simpler pasts. Both responses reflect dissatisfaction with inherited constraints. The temptation of transcendence is particularly revealing. Ideas of uploading consciousness, extending life indefinitely, or merging with machines echo the oldest forbidden aspiration, to overcome mortality. These visions frame death as a technical problem rather than a structural limit. In doing so, they challenge the core boundary established at humanity's creation. Yet even these visions retain traces of the original logic. Immortality is often tied to continued productivity. Eternal life is imagined as endless creativity, innovation, and contribution. The worker persists, unending. The enclosure stretches into infinity rather than dissolving. Regression narratives, by contrast, seek meaning through reduction. Simplicity, nature, and slowness are valorized. These narratives invoke Edin-like imagery of harmony with the earth. Yet they often overlook that the original Edin was not leisure but management. The longing is for relief, not return. Both extremes reveal the same tension. Humanity has outgrown the clarity of its assigned role, but has not replaced it with a stable alternative. Awareness exceeds structure. Capability exceeds guidance. The result is anxiety masked as ambition or nostalgia. Institutions struggle to respond. Education prepares individuals for adaptability, not purpose. Politics manages crises without addressing underlying design. Religion offers meaning but competes with countless alternatives. No single narrative commands universal trust. The system operates without a center. This decentralization could signal collapse, but it could also signal transition. Systems often destabilize before reconfiguration. The question is whether humanity can consciously redesign the assumptions it inherited, or whether it will unconsciously reproduce them in new forms. The challenge lies in recognizing design as design. As long as labor is treated as natural rather than constructed, alternatives remain unthinkable. As long as worth is tied to output, rest appears undeserved. As long as mortality is framed as enemy rather than parameter, fear drives excess. Ancient myths offer an unexpected insight here. The gods were not evil, they were exhausted. Their solution was pragmatic, not malicious. Humanity inherited pragmatism without context. Now, facing similar exhaustion, humanity must decide whether to repeat the pattern or break it. Breaking it does not require rebellion in the traditional sense. It requires reframing value away from constant exertion. It requires accepting limits without treating them as failures. It requires redefining success in terms that do not demand perpetual growth. These ideas are not yet dominant, but they are emerging. Movements advocating degrowth, shared labor, and communal care challenge the Edin framework at its core. They propose systems where work serves life rather than defining it. Whether these proposals can scale remains uncertain. Part 11 marks the moment when inheritance becomes choice. Humanity can no longer claim ignorance of its patterns. The mirror is clear. The fatigue is undeniable. The question is not whether the system is strained, but whether awareness can translate into redesign. The experiment that began as a solution to divine labor has reached a point where its continuation threatens its own stability. The same intelligence that once made humanity useful now makes it responsible. The role of worker is no longer sufficient. The role of caretaker, of systems, of planet, of meaning, presses forward. Whether humanity accepts this role will determine if Edin remains a shadow behind us or becomes a lesson finally understood. Responsibility changes the nature of awareness. Once a system is recognized as inherited rather than inevitable, participation becomes a choice rather than a reflex. Humanity stands within this transition unevenly, with some clinging to old assumptions and others probing for new configurations. The tension between these positions defines the present moment and echoes the earliest fractures in the Edin experiment. One of the clearest arenas where this tension unfolds is time. In the original design, time was cyclical and task-bound. Work followed seasons, rituals, and predictable rhythms. Modern time, by contrast, is linear, accelerated, and monetized. Every moment carries potential value, and wasted time is framed as moral failure. This acceleration amplifies pressure and narrows perception. Yet cracks appear even here. Movements emphasizing slowness, mindfulness, and presence challenge the assumption that faster is better. These practices do not reject work outright, they resist its totalization. By reclaiming time as experience rather than resource, they undermine a core pillar of the Edin framework. Space undergoes similar renegotiation. The garden was enclosed, regulated, optimized. Modern environments, especially urban ones, mirror this logic with zoning, surveillance, and controlled access. Public and private spaces blur as monitoring becomes ambient. The enclosure returns in subtle forms, not as walls, but as networks. In response, humans seek unregulated spaces, wilderness, digital anonymity, altered states, where control weakens. These spaces function as psychological Edens, temporary relief zones. Yet they are rarely sustainable. Even wilderness becomes commodified. Even anonymity becomes monetized. The system adapts quickly. Language reveals this adaptation. Terms like balance, wellness, and sustainability enter mainstream discourse, signaling recognition of limits. However, they are often deployed without structural change, serving as aesthetic corrections rather than functional ones. The enclosure is repainted, not dismantled. Education illustrates this contradiction vividly. Critical thinking is encouraged, but primarily as a tool for innovation within existing systems. Questioning fundamentals remains peripheral. Students learn how to adapt, not how to redesign. Awareness is cultivated, but direction is withheld. This mirrors the post-Eden condition. Knowledge without transcendence. Technology intensifies this gap. Humans now possess tools capable of reshaping biology, climate, and cognition. The power once attributed to gods is partially within human reach. Yet the ethical frameworks guiding this power lag behind its capability. The risk is not malevolence, but replication of old patterns at new scales. Artificial intelligence exemplifies this risk. Systems are built to optimize, predict, and replace human labor, echoing the original motivation behind humanity's creation. The question arises, if humans were created to work and machines are now created to work better, what becomes of humans? The cycle threatens to repeat, with humanity occupying the position once held by the Igigi. This parallel is not metaphorical, it is structural. Automation promises relief but risks displacement. Displacement demands justification. Justification often returns to productivity, pushing humans to compete with their own creations. The enclosure tightens again, now reinforced by comparison to machines. Yet within this tension lies possibility. Recognizing the pattern allows for interruption. If humanity acknowledges that creating replacements for labor without redefining purpose leads to instability, it can choose a different path. That choice requires courage because it challenges the deepest inherited assumption that value derives from utility. Cultural expressions increasingly explore this challenge. Literature, film, and art depict futures where work is optional, meaningless, or oppressive. These narratives do not offer clear solutions, they articulate discomfort. Discomfort is the precursor to change. Religion, too, evolves under this pressure. Some traditions reinterpret doctrine to emphasize compassion over obedience, presence over performance. Others resist change, reinforcing certainty in uncertain times. Both responses reveal that the old framework no longer fits seamlessly. The planetary context sharpens urgency. Environmental degradation exposes the cost of endless extraction. The Earth's response, fires, floods, instability, resembles the corrective measures once attributed to gods. Feedback is no longer symbolic, it is measurable. Humanity confronts the consequences of treating systems as inexhaustible. This confrontation reframes stewardship. Care for the planet becomes not moral luxury, but survival strategy. In this shift, humanity inches toward a role reversal. Instead of being workers maintaining a system designed by others, humans become designers responsible for maintaining the conditions of life itself. This responsibility destabilizes identity. Many experience it as burden rather than empowerment. The comfort of assigned purpose fades. Freedom appears ambiguous. Without external mandate, humans must decide what matters. This decision cannot be outsourced. Part 12 reveals a threshold moment. Awareness has matured to the point where denial is difficult. The Edin framework still operates, but its assumptions are increasingly visible and contested. The system strains under contradictions it can no longer fully absorb. The future hinges on whether humanity can integrate awareness with compassion, capability with restraint. The original experiment solved a problem by displacement. The current moment demands resolution through integration. No new species will be created to carry the burden. No garden will contain the transition. What emerges will not resemble Eden because Eden was never meant to be permanent. It was a stage, not an end. Humanity now approaches a different stage, one without precedent, where the question is no longer how to work, but how to exist without repeating the logic that made work necessary in the first place. Existence without precedent forces confrontation with origin. As humanity approaches conditions never anticipated by its original design, the ancient framework begins to fracture, not from attack, but from mismatch. Systems built to manage scarcity now operate amid abundance. Structures designed to absorb labor now face the prospect of redundancy. The Eden logic persists, but the environment it depends on is changing faster than it can adapt. This mismatch manifests most clearly in the experience of meaninglessness. When survival no longer consumes all energy, the question of purpose grows louder. For most of history, effort itself justified existence. One worked because one had to. Now, increasing numbers of people confront the possibility of having enough food, enough shelter, enough knowledge, yet still feeling unanchored. The absence of necessity exposes the absence of narrative. The original design never required a narrative of fulfillment. It required compliance and continuity. Meaning was embedded in function. Once function weakens, meaning evaporates unless consciously reconstructed. This is the silent crisis underlying modern anxiety. It is not fear of death, but fear of irrelevance. Societies respond to this fear by manufacturing urgency. Deadlines multiply. Crises are framed as perpetual. Attention is fragmented to prevent reflection. The system accelerates not because speed is beneficial, but because stillness invites questions. In this way, busyness becomes a form of containment. Yet containment through acceleration has limits. Cognitive overload produces disengagement rather than obedience. When signals exceed capacity, they lose impact. People stop responding not out of rebellion, but exhaustion. The system that once relied on human responsiveness now contends with widespread numbness. Numbness is dangerous for control structures. It cannot be motivated through fear or reward. It erodes participation quietly. This erosion echoes the moment when the Igigi counted their years and realized endurance had replaced purpose. The difference is scale. What was once a divine labor class is now a global population. At this stage, narratives of destiny lose credibility. People increasingly reject inherited explanations that do not align with lived experience. This rejection does not always produce clarity, it often produces fragmentation. Without shared meaning, communities fracture into subcultures, each offering partial answers. The enclosure breaks into compartments. Some of these compartments seek transcendence through technology, imagining escape from biological and social constraints. Others seek grounding through identity, anchoring meaning in culture, history, or belief. Both strategies attempt to restore certainty without addressing the root design issue. A system built around labor no longer aligns with a species capable of self-reflection beyond necessity. The risk here is repetition. Faced with instability, systems tend to revert to familiar solutions, increased control, stricter norms, and renewed emphasis on productivity promise order. These measures may succeed temporarily, but they deepen the mismatch. They treat symptoms rather than structure. History suggests that such phases often precede transformation or collapse. When a system's core assumptions no longer match reality, it must either evolve or be replaced. Evolution requires intentional redesign. Replacement often occurs through crisis. The Edin experiment avoided collapse by externalizing burden. Humanity now lacks that option. There is no outside onto which exhaustion can be displaced. The planet is finite. Automation only shifts pressure inward. Psychological and ecological limits converge. This convergence demands a redefinition of value. If worth is no longer tied to output, what replaces it? Relationship, creativity, stewardship, and presence emerge as candidates. These values emphasize quality over quantity, depth over scale. They resist easy measurement, making them difficult to integrate into existing systems. Difficulty does not imply impossibility. It implies transition. New frameworks often begin as marginal practices before becoming dominant. Early agriculture was once marginal. Writing was once specialized. Each transformation reconfigured society by redefining what mattered. The challenge lies in maintaining coherence during transition. Without shared narratives, fragmentation accelerates. The task is not to return to Eden, nor to escape it, but to learn from its function. Eden was a solution to a problem. Understanding that problem clarifies what must change. The problem was not work itself, but imbalance. Too much demand placed on too few, too little meaning attached to effort. The solution displaced labor without addressing purpose. Humanity inherited the displacement without the context. Now context returns. The question is no longer why humans must work, but how effort should relate to life. This reframing shifts focus from obligation to alignment. Work becomes one expression of engagement rather than the definition of existence. Such a shift challenges entrenched power structures. Systems built on extraction resist reorientation. They prefer optimization to transformation. Yet optimization cannot resolve existential mismatch. It can only delay it. Part 13 captures the moment where delay becomes costly. Environmental signals intensify. Social cohesion weakens. Mental health crises proliferate. These are not isolated issues. They are indicators of systemic misalignment. The Eden framework, stretched across millennia, strains under conditions it was never designed to handle. Awareness now functions as both catalyst and risk. It enables recognition of patterns, but also amplifies discomfort. Without new narratives, awareness leads to paralysis. With them, it enables evolution. The path forward is not encoded in ancient texts, but those texts illuminate the pattern. Creation as response to exhaustion, order maintained through displacement, stability achieved at the cost of autonomy. These dynamics repeat until consciously addressed. Humanity stands at a threshold where continuation without redesign threatens collapse, and redesign without consensus risks fragmentation. The balance between these outcomes depends on whether awareness can be integrated into structure rather than suppressed by it. Eden was never a home, it was a workshop. Understanding that frees humanity from nostalgia and clarifies responsibility. The question now is not how to return, but how to build a system where awareness and purpose no longer stand in opposition, and where existence does not require exhaustion to justify itself. Moments of transition are rarely recognized as such. While they are unfolding, they are experienced instead as confusion, contradiction, and loss of orientation. Humanity now occupies such a moment, not because the future is unknowable, but because the past has finally become legible. The Edin framework, once invisible, is now widely sensed as constraint rather than order. What was inherited unconsciously is being confronted consciously, and that confrontation destabilizes everything built upon it. One of the most profound destabilizations occurs in how authority is perceived. Authority once derived from proximity to the source of creation, gods, kings, traditions, institutions. As those sources lose credibility, authority fragments. Expertise replaces hierarchy, but expertise itself becomes contested. Trust erodes not because knowledge is absent, but because competing interpretations proliferate. This erosion exposes a weakness in the original design. The system functioned best when purpose was unquestioned and roles were clear. Ambiguity introduces friction. Friction generates heat. Heat demands resolution. Historically, resolution arrived through consolidation or collapse. The difference now is scale. Consolidation risks global rigidity. Collapse risks global damage. The temptation toward consolidation is evident. Surveillance expands. Behavior is quantified. Predictive systems promise stability by reducing uncertainty. These measures echo the logic of Edin's enclosure. Control variables, limit deviation, observe outcomes. Yet applied to a global self-aware population, this logic generates resistance rather than compliance. The enclosure feels too small. Resistance does not always appear as defiance. It often appears as withdrawal. People disengage from institutions they no longer trust. Participation declines. Cynicism spreads. The system loses energy not through attack, but through apathy. This loss mirrors the divine fatigue that initiated creation. Exhaustion repeats itself now at the human level. Collapse narratives gain traction in this environment. They provide coherence when institutions fail to do so. By imagining an end, people regain a sense of direction. Apocalypse becomes a form of meaning-making. It promises closure where the present offers only ambiguity. Yet collapse is not inevitable. History shows that systems can reconfigure without total destruction when awareness is integrated into design. This integration requires reimagining foundational assumptions. For humanity, the most critical assumption is that worth must be earned through constant contribution. Challenging this assumption does not imply passivity. It implies reorientation. Contribution need not equate to extraction. Effort need not equate to depletion. Value can arise from maintenance, care, and restraint. These concepts align more closely with sustainability than productivity, yet they struggle to gain dominance because they resist quantification. Quantification has been the language of control since the first clay tablets. Counting made labor manageable. Measurement made obligation enforceable. Moving beyond quantification threatens the system's ability to regulate behavior. It introduces uncertainty, which systems instinctively avoid. However, uncertainty is not chaos. It is possibility. Eden itself was an experiment born of uncertainty. The gods faced an unknown outcome when they created humanity. They chose pragmatism over perfection. Humanity now faces a similar choice with higher stakes. The redefinition of work sits at the center of this choice. If work is decoupled from survival, what motivates participation? If participation is voluntary, how is coordination achieved? These questions have no simple answers, but they must be addressed to avoid repeating displacement as solution. Community offers one pathway. Small-scale cooperation allows for alignment between effort and outcome. When people see the impact of their actions, meaning returns organically. This was true even within Eden's enclosure, where purpose was clear because context was immediate. Scaling this clarity is difficult but not impossible. Another pathway lies in redefining success across time rather than output. Long-term stewardship values continuity over growth. It rewards preservation rather than expansion. This orientation aligns human activity with planetary limits, addressing the exhaustion now evident in ecological systems. Education becomes crucial in this transition. Instead of preparing individuals solely for adaptability within existing structures, it must cultivate discernment and understanding of when adaptation reinforces harm. Discernment requires historical awareness. Understanding Eden as system rather than myth equips humanity to recognize recurring patterns. Cultural narratives must also evolve. Stories that glorify domination, conquest, and endless progress lose relevance in a constrained world. New stories emphasizing reciprocity, humility, and interdependence gain traction. These narratives do not deny ambition, they contextualize it. Religion, philosophy, and art converge here. Each offers language for values that resist commodification. When integrated thoughtfully, they can counterbalance the Eden framework without rejecting its lessons. The goal is not to erase the past, but to reinterpret it accurately. The greatest risk lies in partial transformation. Adopting new language without changing structure perpetuates illusion. Sustainability without reduced extraction is cosmetic. Mindfulness without systemic change becomes coping rather than solution. The enclosure remains decorated but intact. Part 14 highlights the narrowing window for conscious redesign. Awareness has exposed the pattern. Technology has amplified impact. The planet signals limits unmistakably. Delay compounds cost. Yet urgency must not override care, or transformation becomes another form of extraction. The Eden experiment began as a response to exhaustion. Its legacy now confronts humanity with the same condition. The difference is that humanity cannot externalize the solution. There is no new species to create, no untouched system to exploit. The task ahead is unprecedented: to design a way of living that honors awareness without demanding perpetual strain, that values contribution without reducing beings to function, and that sustains order without enclosure. This task requires imagination disciplined by humility. Whether humanity succeeds depends not on intelligence alone, but on willingness to relinquish assumptions that once ensured survival, but now threaten continuity. Eden's true lesson was never obedience, it was balance. Balance lost can be restored, but only by those who recognize how it was first disrupted. The experiment is no longer external. Humanity has entered its final phase, where the outcome is not predefined. What follows will determine whether Eden remains a warning encoded in myth or becomes the foundation for a system finally aligned with the awareness it helped create. Endings rarely announce themselves as conclusions. They appear instead as inflection points, moments when continuation along the same path becomes visibly unsustainable. Humanity stands within such a moment, not at the collapse of a story, but at the exhaustion of a framework. The Eden experiment has run its course not because it failed, but because it succeeded too thoroughly. The success lay in creating a species capable of sustaining complex systems through effort, coordination, and adaptation. That capacity allowed civilizations to rise, knowledge to accumulate, and environments to be reshaped. But success also carried a hidden cost. The framework assumed endless externalization. of labor, of strain, of consequence. In a closed system, externalization eventually collapses inward. This inward collapse manifests as existential pressure. Individuals feel responsible for outcomes they cannot control. Systems demand engagement without offering coherence. The promise of progress persists, but its destination remains undefined. Humanity moves faster without knowing where it is going, mistaking motion for direction. The realization that motion alone is insufficient marks a quiet revolution. It does not erupt in streets or overthrow governments. It unfolds internally as a growing refusal to accept inherited definitions of success. People begin to ask not how to advance, but why. This question destabilizes the entire structure because it targets purpose rather than process. Purpose cannot be optimized. It cannot be automated. It must be chosen. This requirement exposes the central limitation of the Edin framework. It never required choice. Humanity was designed to function, not to decide what functioning meant. Now decision becomes unavoidable. The fear surrounding this transition is profound. Choice implies responsibility without guarantee. It removes the comfort of assigned roles. Many respond by clinging to familiar structures, even when those structures generate harm. Familiar suffering feels safer than uncertain freedom. Others push toward radical autonomy, rejecting collective frameworks entirely. This response risks fragmentation. Without shared narratives, cooperation becomes difficult. The challenge is to navigate between imposed order and unbounded individualism, forging coherence without enclosure. This navigation demands a new relationship with effort. Effort must be disentangled from worth. Work must be contextualized rather than absolutized. Contribution must be recognized without becoming compulsion. These shifts require cultural transformation deeper than policy or technology can achieve alone. Such transformation begins with memory. Understanding Edin as system rather than moral fable reframes humanity's story. It reveals that suffering was not punishment but byproduct, that labor was not curse but design. This recognition dissolves shame and opens space for intentional change. With shame removed, responsibility can emerge cleanly. Humanity can acknowledge its inheritance without being bound by it. The question becomes not who is at fault, but what is appropriate now. Appropriateness replaces obedience as guiding principle. Appropriateness is contextual. It responds to environment, capacity, and consequence. It resists universal mandates. This flexibility contrasts sharply with the rigid logic of Edin's enclosure, yet it honors its underlying concern for balance. Balance, once lost, can be restored only through conscious effort. Not the effort of endless production, but the effort of restraint, reflection, and coordination. These forms of effort are less visible but no less demanding. They require patience rather than urgency, listening rather than command. The shift towards such effort redefines leadership. Leaders become facilitators rather than enforcers, stewards rather than rulers. Authority derives from trust and competence, not position. This model echoes the earliest role of Enki, not as tyrant, but as problem solver, yet without the displacement that followed. Technology, often framed as threat or savior, becomes tool again. Its role depends on intent. Used to extract, it accelerates collapse. Used to coordinate care, it enables resilience. The difference lies not in capability, but in value alignment. Ecological awareness reinforces this distinction. The planet's limits impose clarity where ideology fails. Systems that ignore feedback collapse, systems that integrate it adapt. Humanity's survival now depends on treating Earth not as substrate, but as partner. This partnership demands humility absent from the original design. Humility does not mean regression. It means recognizing that not all problems require expansion as solution. Sometimes stability is victory. Sometimes enough is enough. These ideas challenge centuries of conditioning, but conditioning can be unlearned. Part 15 brings the narrative to its threshold. The experiment that began as solution has become mirror. Humanity sees itself reflected in the exhaustion that once belonged to gods. The cycle can repeat through new forms of displacement, or it can break through integration. Breaking the cycle requires courage of a different kind, not the courage to conquer or create, but the courage to stop, to reassess, to choose deliberately. It requires trusting awareness rather than fearing it. Eden was never lost because it was never meant to be permanent. Its true function was to initiate a process. That process has matured. The garden has dissolved into the world and the world into humanity. What remains is not exile, but responsibility. The final question is not whether humanity will return to Eden, but whether it will finally understand why Eden existed at all. Understanding transforms inheritance into wisdom. Wisdom transforms effort into care. Care transforms survival into meaning. What follows after this point will not resemble any myth preserved in clay or scripture. It will be authored in real time through choices made under pressure, informed by memory, but not constrained by it. The experiment has reached its handoff. Humanity is no longer the outcome. It is the author. Authorship alters everything. Once a species recognizes itself as the writer rather than the written, continuity becomes choice instead of fate. This recognition does not erase history, nor does it absolve responsibility. It sharpens it. Humanity now carries the weight once borne by distant gods, not as dominion, but as obligation to understand consequence. The Eden experiment culminates here, not in restoration or destruction, but in clarity. What began as a technical solution to exhaustion evolved into a civilizational architecture, then into identity, and finally into tension. That tension was never meant to last forever. It existed to drive adaptation. Adaptation has reached its limit. The next movement must be intentional. Intentionality demands a reorientation of attention. Attention has long been treated as expendable, harvested by systems that benefit from distraction. Yet attention is the substrate of awareness. Without reclaiming it, redesign remains impossible. A distracted species cannot choose deliberately, it can only react. Reclaiming attention does not require withdrawal from the world. It requires presence within it. Presence restores proportion. It reveals where effort is wasted, where harm accumulates, where systems persist beyond usefulness. Presence turns noise back into signal. Signal reveals that many inherited structures persist by inertia rather than necessity. They continue because stopping feels dangerous, not because continuation serves life. Recognizing this distinction is destabilizing but liberating. It opens the possibility of selective preservation rather than total rejection. Not all that emerged from the Eden framework must be abandoned. Coordination, shared language, collective memory, and long-term planning remain essential. What must change is the assumption that these require perpetual extraction of effort to justify existence. Structure can serve life without consuming it. This reframing alters how success is perceived. success shifts from accumulation to coherence, from growth to balance, from dominance to resilience. These metrics resist spectacle. They favor quiet durability over rapid expansion. They reward systems that endure without exhausting their components. Endurance, however, is not stagnation. It is adaptive stability. It allows for movement within bounds that protect the whole. Natural ecosystems demonstrate this principle constantly. Diversity absorbs shock, redundancy prevents collapse, no single element dominates indefinitely. Applying this principle to human systems requires relinquishing the fantasy of total control. Control was always an illusion maintained through displacement. True resilience emerges from relationship rather than command. Relationship distributes responsibility instead of concentrating it. This distribution transforms labor itself. Work becomes situational rather than totalizing. Periods of contribution alternate with periods of rest without moral judgment. Skill replaces grind, mastery replaces endurance. The human capacity to learn, adapt, and care becomes central again. Care, long undervalued because it resists quantification, re-emerges as foundational. Care maintains systems rather than expanding them. It notices early signs of strain. It responds before collapse. In this sense, care is the opposite of exhaustion. It is sustainability in action. Recent history offers glimpses of this shift in moments of crisis. When systems falter, mutual aid surfaces. People organize not for profit, but for continuity. These moments reveal latent capacity for cooperation beyond incentive. They are not anomalies, they are suppressed defaults. Scaling such capacity requires trust. Trust cannot be mandated. It must be cultivated through transparency, accountability, and shared purpose. These elements cannot coexist with structures that benefit from opacity and fragmentation. Redesign thus involves relinquishing certain forms of power. Relinquishment is often framed as loss, but it can be release. Systems that hoard control eventually collapse under their own weight. Systems that share control distribute strain and adapt. The Edin experiment failed to account for this because its goal was immediate relief, not long-term harmony. Humanity now has the benefit of hindsight. It can see how displacement solves problems temporarily while compounding them over time. It can recognize patterns before repeating them. This recognition is the true inheritance of Edin, more valuable than any garden. Mortality remains unchanged, and it should. Finitude gives urgency to care and proportion to ambition. Immortality was never denied out of cruelty, but because it destabilizes balance. Acceptance of limits is not surrender, it is orientation. Within limits, creativity flourishes. Art, play, curiosity, and relationship thrive when not subordinated to extraction. These expressions generate meaning without depletion. They are evidence that existence need not justify itself through exhaustion. The final phase of the Edin narrative is therefore not resolution but integration. Integration of awareness with structure. Integration of capability with restraint. Integration of memory with intention. This integration transforms the experiment into lesson. Lessons do not end stories, they begin new ones. Humanity's next story will not be dictated by gods, markets, or myths alone. It will be shaped by collective choices made under constraint, informed by a deepened understanding of origin. The enclosure has dissolved, not because it was broken, but because it is no longer needed. What remains is open terrain, demanding navigation rather than obedience. Navigation requires attention, humility, and cooperation. This moment will be remembered not for certainty, but for responsibility assumed. The handoff is complete. The system that once required humanity to work now requires humanity to care. The difference is subtle but decisive. Eden was the beginning of work. Its ending is the beginning of wisdom.